The image most people will carry from this game is a deep three-pointer from well beyond the logo. Caitlin Clark, full extension, nothing but net, the crowd erupting in seconds. That shot traveled across social media within minutes of landing. It was clipped, reposted, and dissected from every angle. It became the defining image of Indiana's win over the Golden State Valkyries. But the sequence that actually produced that shot began several possessions earlier on the other end of the floor, with a player most casual viewers never tracked. Lexie Hull. Not for one possession and not in one isolated moment. Hull's influence ran through this game from the opening quarter, through defensive assignments, transition decisions, and the kind of sustained physical effort that rarely appears in a box score but determines the outcome of close games. Her contribution to Indiana's win was substantial, and it went largely unremarked in the immediate aftermath. That's worth examining more carefully. Indiana entered this game with familiar questions hanging over the roster. The offense had looked inconsistent at stretches. Spacing had been an issue. The pace had felt uneven. Golden State, meanwhile, had shown it could disrupt Indiana's rhythm. Physically aggressive and well-organized defensively, the Valkyries had given the Fever real trouble in previous matchups, presenting switching problems, attacking ball handlers, and turning Indiana's transition game into a grind. For much of the first half, those concerns resurfaced. The Fever looked uncomfortable for extended periods. Their offensive execution was choppy. Possessions that should have generated quality shots instead stalled out, and Golden State's defense took credit for a significant portion of that. Indiana was not yet imposing its preferred tempo. Then Hull began dismantling Golden State's offensive rhythm on the other end. The change was not immediate, and it was not loud. Hull does not alter games through volume scoring or explosive individual sequences. She alters them through accumulated defensive pressure, through the kind of consistent lateral containment that makes ball handlers recalculate mid-possession. Her defensive style is positional and disciplined. She stays attached through screens. She does not gamble for steals. She takes away comfort against Tiffany Hayes. That approach proved decisive. Hayes is an efficient, dangerous perimeter scorer who does her best work when she can get downhill with early momentum. When she feels the defense reacting to her rather than cutting off her paths, she becomes increasingly difficult to contain over the course of a game. Hull understood this and defended Hayes accordingly, contesting every catch, crowding every dribble, forcing Hayes to operate under constant physical resistance rather than in open space. Over successive possessions, the effects accumulated. Shots came later in the shot clock. Drives met resistance at the point of initiation. Hayes, who is accustomed to creating efficient looks, was spending energy on possessions that produced nothing. The frustration was visible, and then came the sequence. Hull was defending Hayes tightly when Hayes attempted to manufacture space through a dribble move and elevate for a contested shot. The shot missed. Hull came down with the rebound. What followed was not incidental. Hull immediately pushed the pace, recognizing that the Valkyries' defense had not yet recovered into their half-court set. Rather than allowing Golden State to get organized, she accelerated transition, moving the ball forward quickly enough that Indiana could attack before the defense was settled. That decision, not dramatic, not celebrated, but tactically exact, placed Caitlin Clark in motion with space and rhythm. Clark, receiving the ball in her preferred operating range with the defense still recovering, rose and hit the three from the logo. The arena responded, every camera caught it. The rebound was Lexie Hull's. The transition push was Lexie Hull's. The open look existed because of the choices Hull made in the 3 seconds following the defensive stop. That connection did not trend. The rebound did not get clipped, but in functional basketball terms, the possession from start to finish was constructed by Hull's defense, Hull's rebounding, and Hull's pace judgment. Clark converted. The sequence belonged to both of them. This specific play illustrates something broader about how Hull has been functioning within Indiana's system, and why her role is becoming increasingly important to what the Fever are trying to build. Indiana's offense runs through Caitlin Clark. That is not a criticism, it is a structural reality. Clark handles the ball in pick and roll, creates an isolation, initiates from the perimeter, and absorbs enormous defensive attention throughout every possession. She is asked to do more than most players at any level of basketball are asked to do. Teams game plan specifically around limiting her touches and making her individual creation as difficult as possible. When that is your offensive structure, the supporting pieces around the primary creator become critically important, not just because of what they produce offensively, but because of how they manage their defensive assignments. If Clark is also carrying a heavy defensive burden against the opposing team's best perimeter scorer, her total expenditure of energy per possession increases. Over 40 minutes, that accumulates. It affects shot selection late in games, decision-making speed, and the physical capacity to maintain the driving and finishing rhythm that makes her so dangerous in transition. Hull's ability to absorb a primary defensive assignment and execute it at a high level changes this calculation directly. If Hull can contain or significantly limit Hayes or another dangerous scorer, Clark's defensive burden decreases. That energy doesn't disappear. It transfers to offense, where it produces exactly the kind of aggression and rhythm that defines Clark at her best. In the second half of this game, that trade-off became increasingly visible. Indiana looked faster in transition. Clark was initiating earlier in possessions, operating with more decisiveness. The Fever's offense, which had looked labored at times in the first half, began to move with more fluidity. Players were making quicker decisions. The ball was moving before the defense could settle. Hull's defensive work was a precondition for all of it. Indiana's defensive performance as a unit also improved substantially after halftime, and Hull was centrally involved in that shift. The Fever began rotating more aggressively, contesting more shots at the point of release, and generating more possessions through defensive pressure rather than simply converting on talent. Golden State's offense, which had been fairly productive in the first half, became increasingly stagnant. One possession in the third quarter was particularly illustrative. Hayes attempted a crossover sequence against Hull, looking to create enough separation to initiate a drive. Hull did not commit to either direction. She held her position, read the move, and slid into containment, cutting off the lane without help even arriving. The possession ended without a shot attempt. This kind of sequence does not produce statistics. There is no column in a box score for possessions rendered inefficient. But across a full game, the cumulative effect of that defensive discipline is significant. Scorers who find themselves consistently pressured begin making different decisions, settling for pull-up jumpers earlier than they prefer, passing up first options, deferring. Their rhythm deteriorates, their scoring efficiency drops. That is a direct contribution to winning basketball, even when it produces no countable output. Hull was also functioning well within Indiana's offensive movement patterns in the second half. She has developed a clearer sense of when to cut and when to hold position, when to be a release valve on the perimeter, and when to stay ready for secondary ball movement rather than immediately looking to catch. This kind of spatial awareness is not spectacular, but it is what keeps offenses coherent under defensive pressure. There was a possession in the fourth quarter where Clark drove and drew the collapsing help defense, kicked to Hull on the perimeter, and Hull, rather than immediately shooting, swung the ball further as the Valkyries tried to recover. The rotation continued. Golden State lost track of assignments in the scramble. Hull received the ball again, this time with more room and without a closing defender, and converted the three. In isolation, a made three-pointer is unremarkable. In context, it was the product of correct decision-making at multiple steps: drive, kick, movement, swing, reset, shot. Hull contributed to 3 separate decisions in that sequence and made the right choice each time. That is what functional offensive basketball looks like from a role player at a high level. There is a separate question worth addressing, which concerns what this game suggests about Indiana's trajectory as a team rather than as a collection of individual talents. The Fever have Caitlin Clark, and by extension they have an offensive engine capable of generating high-quality looks from almost any point on the floor in any game situation. Aaliyah Boston provides interior presence, rebounding, and a finishing option that defenses have to respect at close range. Kelsey Mitchell can generate scoring in burst sequences, particularly off the ball in transition. These are meaningful pieces. What has been less clear at times is whether Indiana has the defensive identity and collective connectivity to compete with well-organized opponents when Clark's individual creation is not enough on its own. Championship-caliber teams require players who can be trusted in difficult defensive assignments, who execute rotations correctly without needing constant verbal instruction, who sustain effort over long stretches when the game is not flowing in their favor. In this game, Hull looked like that kind of player. She accepted the difficult assignment against Hayes and executed it over the course of the game, not just in isolated possessions. She maintained her effort level in transition even late in the fourth quarter. She did not look for shortcuts on the defensive end when she had just converted a basket on offense. That kind of consistency, not adjusting effort based on whether things are going well, is what coaches build defensive rotations around. The Fever's collective defensive performance in this game was the best Indiana has shown in recent memory. Hull's presence and positioning were a significant reason why, when she was correctly placed in a rotation, the breakdown did not happen. When she got to a spot ahead of schedule, the offense had to adjust. When she stayed attached to Hayes through a screen sequence, the shot that resulted was a contested one rather than an open one. Multiply those possessions across a full game, and they represent a substantial shift in how hard it is to score against Indiana. Hull also provides Indiana with something less tangible but genuinely relevant lineup flexibility. If she can be reliably deployed against strong perimeter scorers, the Fever are less dependent on specific defensive matchup configurations to survive difficult opponents. They can absorb certain matchup problems without restructuring their entire rotation. That matters in playoff basketball, where opponents adjust across multiple games and teams have to adapt within series. It also creates a situation where Clark, playing beside a player who handles a difficult defensive assignment, can focus her defensive attention on supporting her teammates' rotations rather than being the primary perimeter stopper. That is a different and less taxing defensive role, one that preserves the physical and mental capital she needs to maintain offensive production at the level Indiana requires. None of this is to suggest Hull has arrived as a complete, finished player. She has areas of her game that continue to develop, and consistency at this level across a full season is a different challenge than a strong individual performance. But the elements she displayed in this game, defensive tenacity, positional intelligence, correct decision-making in transition, and the willingness to do unglamorous work at a high level, are not small things. They are the things winning teams are built around.